Hi everyone. So we're going to continue talking about Murphy. I will say at this point, full disclosure, it's getting to be dinner time here at the Ragsdale house. As you can see, I've got a little dirt on my fingers because I just started the grill and I had to clean it off a little bit, and it usually stains me for about a day or so. So anyway, I'll try not to distract you with my dirty hands. But if you hear a little bit of chopping and water, it's just the arrangement of our house, and my wife is doing her part. I get to barbecue. She's preparing the vegetables, and so that's what's going on. I hope it doesn't either distract you, or B, make you hungry. So let's talk about strengths for the Murphy article. I think one of the things that Murphy does well, and actually I'm going to talk about two strengths this time. I have normally been talking about one, not that there's only one or only two, but I don't want to steal your thunder too much. But so this time I'm going to talk about two strengths, and then let you think about those things, see what you think. One of the things that I think Murphy does really well is he is an effective summarizer of previous research. So, for example, on page 322, I believe it is. No, 323 and 324. At the bottom of page 323, under the section entitled Characters, the paragraph that starts and then is continued on 324, Gill notes parallels between the accounts of Ananias and Saul, right? So that paragraph, that is really interesting, but it's also a really good summary of what Gill is doing. And Murphy does it again on page 325. Let's see, under the section entitled Events, the third full paragraph, which begins, the second movement verifies in the eyes of the Jerusalem church. So the very next sentence, Tannehill observes similarities between the early stages of the churches in Antioch and Jerusalem, and then goes on another sentence or two. So this is something Murphy does really well for us. He summarizes what previous folks have thought and said, and I really appreciate those summaries at key points in the article. I think it helps, especially those who are maybe not as familiar with some of these texts, to come up and say, oh, all right, I kind of see some of the movement, some of the flow, and why these ideas are important in the story of Barnabas, who is, of course, the focus of this particular article. I think the second thing that I would say is, on page 331, let me get to it. 331, again, under the section entitled Characters, the 1, 2, 3, third paragraph down, which begins, in Lystra, moreover, the crowd believed that Barnabas and Paul were gods. And then he explains this relationship between Barnabas and Paul and Zeus and Hermes. That's really good. That's really good observation that helps explain. Now, for those of us that are a little bit more familiar with this biblical text, we'd say, oh, that really is important. But it's, even if we're not, it's that kind of summary material, that kind of analysis. There's no footnote here. It seems that this is something that that Murphy's research has led him to. That kind of analysis and summary, which he's done for other writers, but now he gives us a piece like this for himself. It seems that in these characters and events sections, he really brings out some good meaty data in which he can help to prove his point, his thesis. And I'm not going to slip up and tell you what I think it is. I've asked you to do that. I've just told you what I think it's not. So that's a strength that I think Murphy brings to the table. So let's talk a little bit about weaknesses. So sometimes our greatest strength can be our greatest weakness. I think that may be a little bit of something that happens with Murphy. The way he uses other scholars' work it is really good. I've just said that. He notes those important tidbits. See the comment about Gill and the comment about Tannehill. And of course, there's other scholars that he's standing on their shoulders as well. But one of the things that Murphy doesn't seem to do very well is kind of tell us anything. He doesn't perpetuate the argument. He doesn't propel it forward. He doesn't necessarily do anything with those really interesting bits of information and summaries of research. I want him to tell me why this is important. I can see that it is, but my concern is for my students in this class who are not in this particular discipline, but sorry about the paper rattling there if you're hearing that. I want him to say why this is important, and not just for beginners, but even for those of us that have been doing this for a little while. I see that it is important. I see kind of where you're going, but just to quote somebody else doesn't necessarily propel your argument forward. It says that you're familiar with the research and you've summarized it well, but why did you choose this? How does it help your argument? Be more explicit about those kinds of things. And in some respects, I think it kind of leaves it up to the reader to make the connections. Connections I can make, connections you can make, but he doesn't tell me why it's necessarily important to him, right? And so I may think I'm tracking with him, but I'm not. I just think a little bit more detail in terms of how he summarizes other authors' work would be helpful. But that also feeds into a larger critique or a larger weakness that I see with his writing. In between the first paragraph and then scene 1, I looked for it in the first paragraph, and I don't see him necessarily setting out an agenda. This is what I'm going to do. Now, he sets out these 6 scenes in Barnabas's life to help prove his point, but he doesn't tell us why these 6 are important on the front end. He kind of tells us that as we're going through, but it's almost, in some ways, I wonder if it's like what happens when a pastor preaches a sermon, right? He takes us on a journey, or she takes us on a journey and tells us a story, and that's great. But in academic writing, I want to see what your agenda is. I want to say on the front end, okay, so here's my thesis, and I'm going to seek to prove it by doing X, Y, and Z. And it's that part that is missing to me. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's something that I thought was just a little bit of a weakness. There's none of that connective tissue between the thesis and the argument that outlines what the agenda is. And I think about that, that kind of mapping out, that strategic mapping out of how you're going to develop your argument. I think of that as again, to use the metaphor, the connective tissue that holds it all together for us. And so that's me. I would say just a very quick note about the intended audience. It seems clear from the 2 things that I've just pointed out, the strengths and weaknesses, that Murphy's intended audience is an audience that's familiar with the text, and that's with this particular journal, Bibliotheca Sacra, that is to be expected, but that doesn't necessarily negate what I've just said in terms of critique about his development of his argument and his arrangement. Even people that are familiar with the text, clearly familiar with the text, might have trouble, saying, well, why are these important to you? And I don't want it to be left up to me to just kind of discern that. I want you to tell me. Tell me what you're going to say it, and then tell me what you said. That's basic academic writing. Okay, so we'll come back and talk not so much about critique. I'm going to leave that to you because that's based on strengths and weaknesses that you see in the text. I'm going to talk about some reflective pieces having to do with this article.